All right, picture this. You wake up, your tongue feels like it's glued to the roof of your mouth, and your head is absolutely pounding from last night's questionable, cheap wine. The sun's barely even thinking about rising, but the alley outside your window already smells like a butcher's bin left out in July. You reach for the communal jug, take a big, desperate gulp, and congratulations. You've just chugged down a hearty dose of 2,000-year-old intestinal worms. Welcome to Rome, baby. Give it 24 hours and trust me, this city will finish what those delightful parasites just started. Forget your romantic notions of marble and toga parties. We're about to dive into the gritty, brutal reality. This isn't the Rome of Hollywood epics. This is the Rome where your breakfast wants you dead, your apartment wants to crush you, and your neighbors might just set you on fire. Settle in, because we're about to spend a full day in the real Roman Empire, and survival is anything but guaranteed. You know, Roman engineers were absolute geniuses when it came to moving water. Their aqueducts, architectural marvels, truly. Masterpieces of engineering that carried fresh water for miles across the landscape, a testament to a civilization at the height of its power. But keeping that water clean once it got to the city? Yeah, not so much. These magnificent aqueducts, after all that effort, often just dumped their precious cargo into open-topped cisterns. And guess who joined the party there? Rats, pigeons, and all the delightful street runoff you could imagine. Think about it, a giant, uncovered communal bathtub for the entire neighborhood, where every stray animal and bit of urban grime could contribute. Despite their advanced sanitation infrastructure, parasites spread by fecal contamination were a massive problem across the Roman world. Modern tests on ancient Roman pipes and water sources have painted a pretty grim picture. They found eggs of whipworm, roundworm, and even the charming fish tapeworm, all hitching a ride straight into your morning cup. We're talking about water that in one beaker could hold upwards of 100 nematode eggs. The modern safety limit for that? A big fat 0. In fact, studies show that intestinal parasites like whipworm and roundworm actually increased during the Roman period. Why? One theory points to the beloved Roman bathhouses. The warm, communal waters, if not changed frequently, could become a breeding ground for parasites, turning a place of relaxation into a vector for disease. Another culprit was the Roman practice of using human excrement as a crop fertilizer. This would reinfect the population through the very food they ate. And then there was the lead. The wealthy had water piped directly into their homes through an impressive network of fistulae, or lead pipes. While Roman writers like Vitruvius noted the health risks and observed that workers dealing with lead became pale and sick, the convenience and status of lead pipes often won out. Studies have shown that Roman tap water could have had 100 times more lead than the natural spring water flowing into the city. And it wasn't just the pipes. Lead was used to create a sweet syrup called sapa, which was added to cheap, sour wine to make it more palatable, slowly poisoning the drinker with every sip. So, what was the Roman solution for deworming? Crushed pomegranate peel and a whole lot of prayer. Seriously, good luck keeping your breakfast down when your gut starts to twist and knot like a wet rag. It's a stark reminder that even with advanced infrastructure, public health was a constant losing battle. Now, most Romans weren't exactly chilling in sprawling marble villas, were they? No, the vast majority, by some estimates over 90% of the city's 1 million inhabitants, rented a cramped space, often on the 5th or 6th floor of an insula. Think of an insula as a wooden-framed apartment block, slapped together as quickly and cheaply as humanly possible, usually by the lowest bidder. These weren't built to last, they were built to maximize profit in an incredibly crowded city. According to a 4th century census, Rome had over 40,000 of these towering tenements, compared to fewer than 1,800 private homes, or domus. By law, these walls could rise a staggering 70 Roman feet. That's about 21 meters, but often on foundations a mere 3 bricks thick. Let that sink in. The construction materials were just as terrifying. While the ground floors might have a facade of brick, the upper levels were often made of cheap wood and mud brick. The mortar was even worse. Builders looking to cut corners would use a crude mix of rubble and clay instead of proper lime mortar. When this shoddy mix got wet, it would crumble away, turning to sludge. The satirist Juvenal wrote of inhabiting a city supported for the most part by slender props, where landlords would patch up gaping cracks and tell tenants to sleep soundly under a roof ready to collapse. And collapse they did. We're not talking about isolated incidents here. Historical records document at least 40 major building collapses in just 1 century in Rome. Cicero himself casually mentions in a letter that 2 of his own insulae had fallen down, and others were showing deep cracks. His primary concern? Not the tenants, but the opportunity to rebuild and charge higher rents. After one particularly nasty crunch in 27 CE, Emperor Tiberius, bless his heart, briefly ordered landlords to have their properties inspected. The result? Half the city got evicted that very afternoon because their buildings were deemed unsafe. The top floors were the cheapest and most dangerous. If you lived up there, you had no running water, no toilet, and the longest, most treacherous climb up a narrow staircase, your only escape route in an emergency. Tonight, you're not just sleeping under a roof, you're sleeping under a ceiling held up by sheer optimism, a prayer, and a whole lot of termites. Sweet dreams, but maybe keep one eye open. If collapsing buildings didn't get you, the fires probably would. Imagine a city crammed with open flames, flickering oil lamps everywhere, and buildings constructed almost entirely from sun-dried timber. Rome wasn't just a city, it was a colossal bonfire waiting for a spark. And in July of 64 CE, it found one, famously torching 2/3 of the entire metropolis. That wasn't an anomaly. Fires happened so often that the city actually maintained a brigade of 7,000 public slaves, the vigiles urbani, who served as both night watchmen and firefighters. Sounds good, right? A dedicated fire department. Except, before the vigiles were established by Emperor Augustus, firefighting was a private, for-profit enterprise. The most notorious example was the tycoon Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus created his own private fire brigade of 500 slaves. When a building caught fire, his brigade would rush to the scene and do nothing. As the flames grew, Crassus would negotiate with the terrified owner to buy the burning building, and often the neighboring ones threatened by the blaze for a ridiculously low price. If the owner agreed to sell, the fire was put out. If he refused, they let it burn to the ground. Through this ruthless racket, Crassus became one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, eventually owning a huge portion of the city's real estate. Even after the public vigiles were formed, their effectiveness was limited. They patrolled at night, armed with buckets, pumps, and axes, but in the narrow, winding streets of districts like the Subura, a fire could engulf an entire block before help arrived. Even if the walls miraculously survived, they were often just blackened, unstable husks. Did the landlords rebuild properly? Of course not. They'd patch them up with recycled rubble and re-rent them next week, probably to someone just as desperate as you. So, keep a bucket of water handy, because you're absolutely going to need it. The risk of being burned alive in your sleep or losing everything you owned in a citywide inferno was a terrifying constant. Step outside your crumbling, flammable apartment, and things don't exactly improve. After dark, Rome belonged entirely to the muggers. There were no streetlights, so the city was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the occasional flickering torch of someone wealthy enough to afford an armed escort. There was no organized police force to speak of. The urban cohorts were more of a riot squad, and the vigiles were focused on fires. For the average person, walking at night was an open invitation to disaster. Legal texts and satires from the era are filled with accounts of gangs, armed with short swords, heavy clubs, and even dogs specifically trained to go for the throat. If you carried more than a few coins on you, you were marked. The poet Juvenal wrote that you should be happy if you get mugged and only lose a couple of teeth. He also joked, or not so jokingly, that a prudent man wrote his will before venturing out to a dinner party at night. Gangs controlled entire neighborhoods, and political rivals like Clodius and Milo used armed factions to intimidate opponents, leading to open street battles. One chilling court case recounts a student who was stabbed just for his cloak. The attacker actually walked free because, in the words of the judge, "He looked poorer than me, Your Honor." Justice, if you can even call it that, was a very subjective thing. And don't think daytime was much safer. Traffic laws, in an attempt to ease the unbelievable congestion, actually banned wheeled carts and wagons from the city during the first 10 hours of the day. This meant that at night, the streets were filled with the noise and chaos of massive ox carts making their deliveries. During the day, pedestrians shared narrow, filthy lanes with litter bearers, animals, and crowds so thick you could barely move. Get clipped by a cart, trip in an unpaved alley, or simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you weren't just injured, you literally joined the gutter trash. Bodies were often left lying in the streets until morning, a grim testament to the city's indifference. The stench, the noise, the constant threat of violence or accident, navigating the streets of Rome was an extreme sport. Okay, so let's say you survived the water, the falling buildings, the fires and the muggers. But now you've got a nasty infection from a cut or a mysterious fever. Time to see the doctor. Roman medical theory was a bizarre mix of genuine genius and outright horror, mostly inherited from the Greeks. Surgeons, for instance, were surprisingly advanced. Military surgeons in particular could stitch a torn gladiator artery, perform amputations, and even conduct basic neurosurgery like trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure. Survival rates for trepanation could be as high as 50%. They even washed their instruments in hot water before use. Pretty impressive, right? But here's the reality for the patient. For anesthetic, you got a stick to bite down on, maybe a strong dose of wine or opium if you were lucky. That was it. Infection? Wash the wound with vinegar like wine, which, to be fair, had some antiseptic properties, but only if the patient managed to survive the initial shock and pain without bleeding out or dying of agony. A common theory of disease was based on balancing the 4 humors in the body, so treatments often involved bloodletting or prescribing specific diets. Need a painkiller? They might mix willow bark, which contained a precursor to aspirin, with, get this, lead salts. Fancy improving your fertility? Doctors prescribed powdered mouse dung. Yes, really, it's no wonder the average life expectancy hovered around 25 years. This wasn't because everyone dropped dead at 30, it was because so many infants and young children perished from common diseases, pulling the average down dramatically. A recent study of skeletons from working-class Roman graves showed an average age of death of just 30, with bones riddled with arthritis and evidence of poorly healed fractures. Your simple twisted ankle could easily end in gangrene, and gangrene, in ancient Rome, invariably ended in a quicklime grave. With no understanding of germ theory and anyone able to call themselves a doctor without training, even minor ailments could quickly become fatal. If you were lucky enough to be alive, you still had to eat, and that meant work. 70% of Rome's population lived hand to mouth. No work, no bread, no mercy. And Roman jobs? They came with lethal fine print. The phrase, dead-end job, wasn't just an idiom in Rome. It was a literal, ever-present threat. If you were a miner, you were likely a slave condemned to the mines, a punishment considered a death sentence. You would inhale silica dust until your lungs bled, dying a slow, agonizing death from silicosis. Fullers, who processed and cleaned cloth, stood all day in vats of human urine and toxic sulfur, a combination that often rotted the skin right off their fingers and feet. Bakers worked next to grain dust clouds that could, and often did, explode like flour bombs, while the constant inhalation of flour caused chronic lung disease. Slave oarsmen in the Roman Navy rowed until their vertebrae cracked from the strain. If you slowed your pace, the overseer's whip, often tipped with lead pellets, ensured you picked it back up. Even what we might consider decent gigs, like a schoolteacher, a scribe, or an actor, depended entirely on the whims of powerful patrons. These patrons could, and would, sell you into slavery to pay off their gambling debts if they felt like it. Perhaps the most dangerous job of all, being the emperor. Of all Roman emperors, only about 25% died of natural causes. The rest were murdered, killed in battle, or forced to take their own lives. For the common person, there was no social safety net, no workers' rights, just brutal labor and constant precarity. Your life was cheap, and your labor was cheaper. And if all those daily dangers weren't enough, there was Roman justice, which, let's be honest, absolutely adored social rank. This wasn't about equality under the law, not even close. Roman law operated on a dual penalty system, formally dividing people into the honestiores, the elites, and the humiliores, the lower classes. These two groups could commit the exact same crime and receive vastly different punishments. A senator, for example, could kill a slave and probably just pay a small fine, if anything at all. A slave, however, who dared to strike a free man, that was a one-way ticket to crucifixion. In fact, crucifixion was a punishment reserved specifically for non-citizens and the lowest classes, designed as a public display of terror. Trials often lasted mere minutes, evidence was largely optional, and lawyers openly expected bribes to even consider your case. If you couldn't pay, you defended yourself, usually while bruised, chained, and utterly bewildered. For the humiliores, penalties were brutal. They ranged from damnatio ad bestias, being thrown to wild beasts in the arena for public entertainment, to damnatio ad metallum, a death sentence to the mines. Other options included the classic beaten with rods, then beheaded, always in public, always for morale. One particularly gruesome punishment for parricide, killing a parent, was poena culeae, the penalty of the sack. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, and then thrown into a river. The upside, if you can call it that, was that death was so routine, so commonplace, that Roman graffiti from the time brags. Once you've seen a guy eviscerated on the street, nothing phases you. It was a legal system designed to uphold power structures, not to deliver fairness, and for the vast majority, it was just another terrifying threat to their already fragile existence. Now, let's zoom out a bit. Outside the bustling, dangerous capital, survival actually got even harder. If you lived in the provinces, those vast territories that made up the Roman Empire, you faced a whole new set of challenges. Provincial taxes could easily hit 1/3 of your entire harvest. Had a bad year due to drought or blight? Too bad. The Roman tax collector wasn't interested in your hardship, they were interested in their quota. Failure to pay meant your land, your tools, and even your family could be seized. Revolts, often sparked by desperation and famine, were crushed with brutal, scorched earth tactics. When Titus put down the Jewish revolt, his forces were said to have salted the agricultural lands to ensure nothing would grow for years. On the frontiers, where legions were stationed, army supply trains took grain first, leaving local villages to literally chew bark to survive. A single failed crop wasn't just a bad season, it triggered mass migration, desperate parents selling their own children into slavery or abandoning them under the famed pillar of exposure in cities hoping someone else might take them in. If famine didn't kill you, the ruthless tax collector would sell your tools, seize your land, and leave you to watch the rats eat your precious seed grain, ensuring you wouldn't survive the next season either. Life in the provinces was a constant tightrope walk between survival and utter destitution, entirely at the mercy of a distant, demanding, and often cruel imperial machine. And finally, the ultimate equalizer, disease. Those incredible Roman roads and efficient trade routes that moved legions and goods so effectively, they also moved disease faster and further than ever before. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, hit in 165 CE, ferried home by soldiers returning from campaign in the east. It didn't just spread, it peeled through cities at wagon speed, leaving utter devastation in its wake. At its peak, the historian Cassius Dio reported that 2,000 people were dying per day in the city of Rome. Estimates for the total death toll run as high as 10 million people, potentially 10% of the entire empire's population. There was absolutely no concept of quarantine protocols. Families would simply dump corpses in mass pits and then often head straight back to the market or the public baths. Recent research suggests these major plagues were linked to periods of colder, drier climate, which may have stressed populations and made them more susceptible to illness. Trade ships sailing across the Mediterranean spread the plague from coast to coast faster than any news could possibly warn people. If you felt that telltale fever and the rash appeared, you probably had a week, maybe two, before it was all over. Doctors, in their infinite wisdom, might advise hanging garlic around your neck. The virus naturally just laughed. One bout of this plague shattered the empire's confidence and manpower. Then, less than a century later, a second major outbreak, the plague of Cyprian, struck in 251 CE, killing up to 5,000 people a day in Rome and halving the populations of some cities. In a world without immunity, without modern medicine, and with dense, interconnected populations, geography offered zero safety. The sheer scale and frequency of these epidemics were a terrifying, uncontrollable force that could wipe out entire communities in a matter of weeks. So, think your modern life is rough? Got a tough Monday ahead? Try explaining that to your worm-ridden Roman, still wondering if his apartment building is going to collapse. If you somehow manage to survive this whirlwind tour of ancient Rome, do yourself a favor. Hit that subscribe button and then go watch Worst Jobs in Ancient Rome next. Trust me, you'll feel a whole lot better about your desk job. Those majestic marble columns might look solid and serene in travel photos, but take a peek behind the plaster, and ancient Rome was, for most people, an absolute horror show. It was a daily struggle against parasites, collapsing buildings, raging fires, and a legal system that treated life like loose change. You might fantasize about toga parties and decadent banquets, but step through a time portal and you'd be incredibly lucky to last 24 hours. So, the next time your Wi-Fi lags or your coffee order gets messed up, just remember, at least your tap water isn't 80% lava and slowly poisoning you with lead. History is brutal, yes, but hey, it makes even the most miserable modern Monday feel like a relaxing day at the baths.